Alarms filled my ship before I even opened my eyes. Red light poured through the chamber, and the floor shook beneath me like something enormous had struck the hull. I am Kalen Vothar, an officer of the Threll Dominion, and on that night I learned that everything my empire believed about humans was wrong. I had been sleeping in my quarters aboard the flagship Aurelius Crown when the first explosion tore through the lower decks. My assistant, a small floating drone named Peya, screamed data at me faster than I could process. Hull breach, weapons offline, enemy vessel undetected until it was already inside our formation. I ran to the bridge barefoot, my uniform half-fastened, my mind refusing to accept what the sensors were showing. A single human ship, small compared to our battlecruiser, had slipped past our entire defensive screen without triggering a single alarm. By the time we noticed it, it was already close enough to strike our engines directly. Commander Rallick, my superior, stood frozen at the viewport, staring at the wreckage of 2 support ships drifting in space. His voice shook when he spoke. How did they get past us? How did one ship do this to a fleet 3 times its size? I did not have an answer then, but I would find one soon, and it would change how I saw every star in this galaxy. To understand how we reached that terrible night, you must go back further, to the days when we still laughed at humanity. The Threll Dominion had existed for over 4,000 years. We had brought order to hundreds of star systems, absorbed dozens of species into our empire, and built a civilization so vast that no single mind could hold its full shape. We believed we understood every form of intelligent life. We were wrong about that too. When our scouts first found Earth, the reports were almost comedic. A single, isolated planet, home to one species, with no interstellar travel and barely functioning global cooperation. Our analysts labeled them a Tier 7 species, the lowest possible classification, reserved for cultures still fighting among themselves over land and resources. I remember reading the first report aloud to my colleagues in the officers' lounge, and everyone laughed. They fight wars over borders that do not even span a single continent, said Lieutenant Orrin Basketh, wiping tears of amusement from his eyes. They have not even finished exploring their own ocean floors, and yet they build weapons capable of destroying their whole planet. What a strange, self-destructive little species. I laughed with him. I did not know any better. Our first contact with humans came through a diplomatic envoy sent to a small colony they had established on a moon near their solar system. The colony was called Ashgrove Landing, home to a few thousand settlers who had traveled there to mine rare minerals. Our envoy, a calm and diplomatic Threll named Senna Vorel, reported that the humans there were surprisingly organized, disciplined, and confident for a species so young in the interstellar community. I remember Senna's message clearly. She said something that I dismissed at the time but now think about constantly. She said, "These people do not act like a species that fears losing. They act like a species that has already lost everything before and rebuilt from nothing." The Council did not take her warning seriously. Instead, they saw an opportunity. Ashgrove Landing sat above a mineral deposit that could fund several new shipyards. A resolution was proposed to bring the colony under Dominion authority, framed diplomatically as an offer of protection and infrastructure support. In truth, it was an annexation. One voice spoke against it. Xenologist Doran Petch, an old scholar who had spent decades studying primitive species, stood before the council and warned that humans were fundamentally different from every species we had encountered before. He said their history was filled with moments where they should have been destroyed, by disease, by war, by their own environment, and yet they always adapted, always survived, always found a way to strike back harder than expected. The council dismissed him. They called his warnings outdated fear-mongering from a scholar who had spent too much time studying ancient records instead of current intelligence. The vote passed. A fleet was assigned to enforce the annexation of Ashgrove Landing, led by Commander Rallick, with me serving as his intelligence officer. I still remember boarding the transport ship, feeling nothing but confidence. We were the Threll Dominion. We had subdued species with far greater technology than humanity possessed. This would be simple. This would be over before the humans even understood what was happening. I could not have been more wrong, and the moment I realized it would haunt me for the rest of my life. We arrived at Ashgrove Landing, under the cover of a diplomatic pretense, presenting ourselves as a support fleet arriving to formalize a partnership agreement. The colony's governor, a woman named Claire Dunmore, met with our delegation calmly, almost too calmly for someone who had just learned her home was being absorbed into an empire she had never asked to join. She listened to our terms without interruption. When we finished, she asked a single question: what happens if we refuse? Commander Rallick explained, with practiced patience, that refusal was not truly an option, that resistance would only result in unnecessary conflict, and that cooperation was in everyone's best interest. Claire Dunmore smiled, thanked us for our time, and left the meeting room without another word. That night, our sensors detected a small vessel leaving the colony's dock. Our analysts assumed it was a supply ship heading to a nearby asteroid facility. We paid it little attention. It would be the last mistake many of my colleagues ever made. 3 hours later, hidden charges detonated across 2 of our support cruisers, tearing through engine cores that had been considered impossible to reach without direct access to restricted maintenance corridors. We later learned that a small group of colony engineers, led by a former mining supervisor named Ethan Cole, had spent that time slipping aboard our ships, disguised as maintenance workers, sent to assist with, ironically, the very partnership agreement we had proposed. They did not fight us with weapons we recognized. They fought us with patience, timing, and an intimate understanding of engineering systems that our own crews had grown complacent about. By the time we identified the sabotage, both ships were beyond saving. Commander Rallick ordered an immediate show of force, hoping to frighten the colony into surrender. Instead, the response from the surface came within minutes, a broadcast transmission sent to every ship in our fleet. It was Claire Dunmore's voice again, calm as before. "We did not start this conflict," she said, "but we will finish it on our terms, not yours." I remember standing beside Commander Rallick as the bridge fell silent. For the first time since joining the Dominion fleet, I felt something I did not recognize immediately. It took me a moment to understand that the feeling was fear. That night, the ship that struck our flagship arrived without warning, without hesitation, and without any signal of surrender. It was the same ship that had left the colony hours earlier, the one we assumed was carrying supplies. It had instead been carrying something else entirely, a crew willing to take enormous risks against overwhelming odds because they believed their home was worth defending no matter the cost. When the attack ended and the wreckage settled, our fleet had lost 3 vessels and dozens of crew members. The colony had lost nothing but a single small transport ship, and even that vessel managed to retreat successfully before we could organize a counterattack. Commander Rallick stood on the bridge, staring at the reports, unable to speak for several long moments. Finally, he turned to me and asked the question that would define the rest of my career within the Dominion. "What are these people, Kalen? What in the stars are we truly dealing with?" I did not have an answer, but I intended to find one, no matter what it cost me to learn it. The Dominion High Command did not want the truth about Ashgrove Landing to spread. Within a day of our retreat, the official reports filed by Commander Rallick were rewritten by administrators far above his rank. The word defeat never appeared anywhere in the records. Instead, the incident was labeled an unexpected technical anomaly involving unstable mining equipment. 3 destroyed vessels became a routine maintenance loss. Dozens of dead crew members became a minor casualty count attributed to accidental depressurization. I read the official version of events with a mixture of anger and disbelief. I had been there. I had seen the calculated precision of the sabotage, the confidence in Claire Dunmore's voice, the terrifying efficiency of a species we had dismissed as primitive. Yet somehow, within the halls of Dominion Command, none of that seemed to matter as much as protecting the Empire's pride. Commander Rallick was quietly reassigned to a research outpost near the Outer Rim, a position that carried the appearance of promotion but functioned as a way to remove an inconvenient witness from public view. Before he left, he called me into his quarters one final time. "Kalen," he said, his voice heavier than I had ever heard it, They are going to bury what happened out there. They are going to pretend humans are nothing more than an unfortunate delay in our expansion plans. But I want you to remember what you saw. Someday, someone in this empire will need to understand the truth, and it might as well be you." I promised him I would not forget, and I never did. In the following months, I requested a transfer to Dominion Intelligence, specifically to the newly formed Human Behavior Division, a small and mostly ignored department tasked with monitoring the species after the Ashgrove incident. Most officers considered this assignment a step backward in their careers. Studying a Tier 7 species was hardly glamorous work compared to overseeing established colonies or commanding battle fleets. I did not care about glamour. I wanted answers. My new supervisor, an aging analyst named Torvid Kess, seemed surprised that anyone had volunteered for the position. He handed me a stack of files nearly as tall as I was and told me to start reading. Most of what I found in those early days only deepened my confusion rather than resolving it. Human history, as recorded by our observation satellites and intercepted communications, painted a picture of a species defined by contradiction. They fought brutal wars against each other for centuries, yet built organizations dedicated entirely to preventing future conflicts. They developed weapons capable of ending their own civilization, yet somehow avoided using them even during their most heated global disputes. They experienced diseases that wiped out significant portions of their population throughout history, yet always rebuilt, always multiplied, always pushed forward into harsher and more distant frontiers. I began compiling a private theory, one I dared not share with my superiors at first. Humans were not simply resilient by circumstance, they were resilient by design, shaped by countless generations of hardship into a species that treated struggle not as an obstacle to avoid, but as a natural part of their existence. Meanwhile, tensions between the Dominion and human territories continued to simmer. Ashgrove Landing remained independent, protected now by a small but highly motivated defense militia that had grown rapidly since the failed annexation attempt. Reports from Dominion patrol ships indicated increased human shipping activity throughout the region, along with the construction of several new defense platforms along their border systems. Then came the second incident, one that would further prove how little we truly understood about the species we had underestimated. A Dominion trade vessel, the Solvane Drift, strayed too close to human-patrolled space while attempting to bypass tariff checkpoints established after the Ashgrove conflict. The captain, believing human patrol ships posed little threat compared to Dominion military vessels, ignored a warning transmission ordering him to alter course. Within minutes, a single human patrol ship, small and lightly armed compared to Dominion standards, disabled the Solvane Drift's engines with precise, non-lethal strikes designed specifically to avoid loss of life. The human ship then boarded the vessel, confiscated its illegal cargo, and released the crew unharmed with a written notice outlining the violation. What struck me most about this incident was not the tactical skill involved, though that alone was impressive given the technological gap between our fleets. What struck me was the restraint. The humans had every opportunity to destroy the Solvane Drift entirely, yet chose instead to demonstrate control, precision, and a clear message. We are capable of far worse, but we choose not to escalate unless forced to. I presented this analysis to Torvid Kess, along with several other similar incidents collected over the following weeks. Each time, human forces displayed a pattern of calculated restraint combined with overwhelming tactical competence whenever conflict became unavoidable. They were not simply lucky at Ashgrove Landing, they were consistently, methodically dangerous. Torvid listened to my presentation with visible skepticism. "Kalen," he said, "you are letting a handful of unusual incidents shape an entire theory about a species with barely any interstellar experience. Humans have no standing fleet capable of challenging even a single Dominion battle group directly. Whatever tricks they used at Ashgrove Landing, they cannot be repeated on a larger scale." I wanted to believe him. Truthfully, some part of me still clung to the comfort of Dominion superiority, the belief that our 4,000 years of expansion and conquest could not possibly be threatened by a species so recently introduced to interstellar life. But another part of me, the part that had stood beside Commander Rallick on that bridge and felt genuine fear for the first time in my life, knew that dismissing humanity so easily would eventually cost us dearly. I requested authorization to travel closer to human territory, not as a combatant, but as an observer attached to a diplomatic mission tasked with maintaining fragile relations following the Ashgrove incident. After considerable delay, my request was approved, largely because no one else within the Human Behavior Division wanted the assignment. Before my departure, I visited the archives to review Doran Petch's original warnings from the council meeting that authorized the Ashgrove annexation. His words felt eerily prophetic now, filled with observations that had been dismissed as outdated fear-mongering but now seemed disturbingly accurate. He wrote of humanity's tendency to unite rapidly during moments of external threat, setting aside internal conflicts that had divided them for generations. He wrote of their historical pattern of initial losses followed by devastating counteroffensives once their full capabilities were mobilized. Most importantly, he wrote of something he called their defining trait, a stubborn refusal to accept defeat as permanent, treating every loss not as an ending, but as information to be studied and improved upon. I copied his notes carefully, knowing they would prove valuable in the months ahead. I did not yet realize just how valuable they would become. My diplomatic assignment took me to a neutral space station located along the border between Dominion and human-controlled territory, a location informally known among traders as Halden's Rest. It served as a meeting point for merchants, diplomats, and travelers from both species, offering a rare opportunity for direct, unfiltered contact with humans outside the tension of military conflict. I arrived expecting caution, perhaps even hostility, given the recent history between our peoples. Instead, I found something far more unsettling than open aggression. I found confidence. The humans aboard Halden's Rest moved through the station with an ease that suggested they belonged there fully, unbothered by the presence of Dominion diplomats or the underlying tension between our governments. They negotiated trade deals with sharp, calculated precision, always securing favorable terms without appearing desperate or aggressive. They socialized freely with representatives from other species, including several Dominion officers who had grown curious enough to set aside official caution. It was there that I first met Sophie Marlowe, a human historian traveling aboard a research vessel that had docked temporarily for resupply. She approached me directly in the station's central lounge, apparently unbothered by protocol or hierarchy, in a way that still surprises me when I remember it. "You are the one studying us," she said, without introduction or hesitation. "I have heard about your division, human behavior analysis. Is that right?" I confirmed her assumption, somewhat taken aback by her directness. She smiled, seemingly amused by my discomfort, and gestured toward an empty table nearby. "Sit down," she said. "If you truly want to understand humanity, you will learn far more from an honest conversation than from another stack of intercepted communications." I accepted her invitation, unaware that this single conversation would reshape everything I believed about the species my empire had once dismissed as insignificant. Sophie Marlowe spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had spent her entire career studying patterns that others overlooked. She explained that she worked as a historian attached to a human research initiative dedicated to documenting first contact events across multiple frontier worlds. Her current assignment involved traveling between border stations, collecting perspectives from both human settlers and representatives of neighboring species. I asked her directly why humans had reacted so decisively during the Ashgrove landing incident, expecting perhaps a rehearsed diplomatic answer designed to avoid revealing sensitive military details. Instead, she answered with startling honesty. "We do not like being told what to do, especially by someone claiming authority over something we already built ourselves," she said. Claire Dunmore spent 15 years turning Ashgrove Landing from an empty mining outpost into a functioning community. When your fleet arrived offering protection nobody asked for, in exchange for control nobody wanted to give away, there was really only one answer she was going to provide. I pointed out that resistance against a Dominion fleet regardless of principle, seemed like an enormous risk for a colony with such limited military resources. Sophie considered this for a moment before responding. "You are thinking about it the wrong way," she said. "You are imagining a battle between two armies, measuring strength by ship count and weapon output. We think about it differently. We think about what we are willing to lose in order to keep what matters most. Ashgrove Landing was never going to defeat your fleet through direct combat, but your fleet was never actually prepared to fight people who had already decided that losing everything was preferable to losing control over their own future." Her words settled uncomfortably in my mind, echoing Doran Petch's warnings from the council meeting months earlier. I asked her to explain further, curious whether this attitude represented an isolated cultural trait or something deeply embedded within human history as a whole. Sophie leaned back in her seat, considering the question carefully before answering. "Do you know much about human history before we reached the stars?" she asked. I admitted that Dominion records on the subject remained relatively sparse, focused mostly on technological development rather than social or cultural evolution. Sophie nodded, as though she had expected this answer. "Our species almost did not survive several times throughout our history," she said. "Ice ages nearly wiped us out entirely more than once. Diseases swept through our populations and killed staggering percentages of entire regions within a matter of months. We fought wars against each other so devastating that entire generations grew up believing peace was a temporary illusion rather than a permanent possibility. And yet here we are, spreading out among the stars, meeting new species, building new colonies, still finding reasons to keep pushing forward despite everything that has tried to stop us along the way." She paused before continuing, her tone growing slightly more serious. "We are not special because we are naturally stronger or smarter than every other species out there. We are dangerous because we have never been given the luxury of assuming things will simply work out. Every generation before us fought for the right to exist, and that struggle shaped something into our collective character that does not disappear just because we finally found peace and stability at home." I found myself unable to dismiss her explanation as simple cultural pride. It aligned too closely with the patterns I had already documented, the calculated restraint combined with overwhelming capability whenever conflict became unavoidable, the rapid unification during moments of external threat, the stubborn refusal to accept defeat as anything more than temporary. Over the following days, I remained aboard Halden's Rest, using my diplomatic credentials to arrange additional conversations with humans passing through the station. Sophie, apparently intrigued by my genuine curiosity rather than typical Dominion condescension, helped facilitate several of these meetings. I spoke with a retired soldier named Nathan Price, who had served during a regional conflict on a human colony world decades before Ashgrove Landing became relevant to interstellar politics. He described combat situations where his unit, vastly outnumbered and poorly equipped compared to their opponents, managed to hold defensive positions through sheer stubborn persistence rather than superior firepower. "We were not trying to win through strength we did not have," Nathan explained, his expression distant as he recalled old memories. "We were trying to make the cost of victory so unbearable that our opponents would eventually decide it was not worth continuing. Sometimes that meant holding a position long after logic suggested we should retreat. Sometimes it meant finding creative solutions using whatever limited resources we had available. Either way, the goal was never to overpower our enemy directly. The goal was to outlast them." I asked him whether this approach ever failed, expecting perhaps a rare admission of vulnerability that might reveal weaknesses within human military doctrine. Nathan considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "Of course it failed sometimes," he admitted. "We lost battles, we lost people we cared about, but even in defeat, we learned something useful for the next fight. That is probably the most important thing you should understand about us. We treat every loss as a lesson rather than an ending. Whatever mistake caused that defeat becomes the exact thing we make sure never happens again." His words reminded me strongly of Doran Petch's original warnings, further confirming that this pattern represented something deeply embedded within human culture rather than an isolated incident specific to Ashgrove Landing. I also spoke with Claire Dunmore herself, who happened to be traveling through Halden's Rest on business related to expanding trade agreements for her colony. She agreed to meet with me despite our previous encounter during the failed annexation attempt, apparently viewing our conversation as an opportunity for honest dialogue rather than lingering hostility. I asked her directly whether she had anticipated the possibility of losing everything when she chose to resist Dominion authority rather than accepting the proposed partnership agreement. She answered without hesitation. Every single day since I arrived on that moon, I knew there was a chance I would lose it all, she said. Mining accidents, equipment failures, resource shortages, any number of things could have ended our community before your fleet ever arrived. I did not build Ashgrove Landing believing failure was impossible. I built it knowing failure was always a possibility, and choosing to try anyway, because the alternative was never trying at all. I asked whether she regretted the confrontation, given the casualties suffered by both sides during the conflict. Her expression grew somber, though her resolve remained unshaken. I regret that people died, she said quietly. I regret that violence became necessary at all. But I do not regret refusing to hand over something my community built with our own hands and our own sacrifice. If your empire had approached us honestly, seeking genuine partnership rather than disguised annexation, this entire conflict could have been avoided. That failure belongs to your council, not to us. Her words struck me deeply, forcing me to confront an uncomfortable truth about the Dominion's approach toward humanity. We had underestimated them not simply because of their technological limitations, but because we had failed to recognize the strength of their character, their willingness to endure hardship for something they believed was worth protecting. I compiled everything I had learned during my time aboard Halden's Rest into a comprehensive report, intending to present it directly to Dominion High Command upon my return. My analysis concluded that humanity represented a uniquely dangerous species, not because of overwhelming military capability, but because of psychological and cultural resilience developed through countless generations of hardship and struggle. I warned that further aggression against human territories would likely result in catastrophic consequences for the Dominion, regardless of our technological advantages. I emphasized that humans consistently demonstrated calculated restraint combined with devastating capability whenever conflict became unavoidable, suggesting that any future confrontation would escalate far beyond what our military planners currently anticipated. Most importantly, I warned that humanity's rapid capacity for unification during moments of external threat meant that any aggressive action against a single human colony risked provoking a coordinated response from their entire species rather than an isolated defensive action. I submitted my report through official channels, hoping that concrete evidence gathered directly from human sources would finally convince Dominion leadership to abandon further expansion attempts into human territory. I traveled back toward Dominion space feeling cautiously optimistic that reason and evidence might prevail over pride and ambition. I could not have been more wrong about that either. Upon returning to Dominion headquarters, I discovered that my report had been received with polite acknowledgement, but little genuine consideration. Torvid Kess informed me that several council members viewed my conclusions as overly sympathetic toward humanity, suggesting that my extended time among human settlements had compromised my objectivity as an analyst. I argued passionately that my conclusions were based entirely on documented patterns and direct testimony, not personal sympathy. Torvid seemed genuinely sympathetic to my frustration, but explained that political momentum within the council had already shifted toward a more aggressive stance regarding human territories, driven largely by economic pressure from mining consortiums eager to access resource-rich systems currently under human control. "Kalen," he said gently, "you are not wrong about what you observed, but convincing powerful people to abandon ambition based on evidence alone has never been an easy task throughout our empire's history. Sometimes people only learn from consequences they experience directly, rather than warnings they receive in advance." I left that meeting feeling a deep sense of dread, uncertain whether anything I had learned would matter before the Dominion made a mistake far more severe than the failed annexation of Ashgrove Landing. I did not yet know how right my fears would prove to be, nor how quickly the consequences would arrive. 3 months after I submitted my report, the Council convened an emergency session following a border dispute near a resource-rich system called Varen's Expanse, an area claimed by both Dominion mining interests and an expanding human settlement network. What began as a minor disagreement over extraction rights quickly escalated into something far more dangerous, largely because certain council members seemed determined to use the incident as justification for the aggressive action they had wanted to pursue for months. High Councillor Threxa Mulvane, a powerful figure within Dominion politics with close ties to several mining consortiums, addressed the Council with confident authority. She argued that recent incidents, including a minor confrontation between Dominion survey teams and human patrol ships near Varen's Expanse, demonstrated a pattern of human aggression that could no longer be tolerated without response. I watched the session from a secondary viewing chamber, unable to directly address the Council but permitted to submit written commentary through my supervisor. I argued strongly against Threxa Mulvane's characterization, pointing out that available evidence suggested the confrontation near Varen's Expanse had actually begun when Dominion survey teams entered contested territory without proper authorization, and that human patrol ships had responded with the same calculated restraint I had documented previously. My commentary was acknowledged but ultimately dismissed. The Council voted overwhelmingly in favor of what they termed a decisive punitive action, designed to establish clear boundaries regarding Dominion authority within contested border regions. A significant portion of the Dominion's Outer Rim fleet, commanded by Admiral Varric Thane, received orders to advance toward human-controlled territory surrounding Varen's Expanse, with authorization to use whatever force necessary to secure the region permanently. I requested permission to accompany the fleet as an intelligence advisor, hoping that my presence might help prevent unnecessary escalation once the situation developed further. My request was granted, largely because Admiral Thane, unlike many of his colleagues, seemed genuinely interested in avoiding another embarrassment similar to the Ashgrove landing incident. During our journey toward Varen's Expanse, I briefed Admiral Thane extensively regarding everything I had learned about human military doctrine and cultural resilience. He listened carefully, taking notes throughout our conversations, occasionally asking sharp, insightful questions that suggested genuine consideration of the risks involved. "If what you are telling me is accurate," he said during one of our final briefings before arrival, "then a full-scale assault against human territory could trigger a response far beyond anything our current fleet is prepared to handle." I confirmed his assessment, emphasizing that humanity's capacity for rapid unification meant that any significant conflict near Varen's Expanse would likely draw response fleets from across their entire settlement network, rather than remaining isolated to local defensive forces. Admiral Thane considered this information seriously, ultimately requesting additional reinforcements from Dominion Command before proceeding with direct military action. Unfortunately, Councillor Mulvane, impatient with what she viewed as unnecessary delay, overruled his request, insisting that the current fleet possessed more than sufficient strength to accomplish the mission without additional support. We arrived at Varen's Expanse to find human defense forces already mobilized, commanded by a decorated officer named Lucas Bennett, whose reputation as a tactical strategist had grown significantly following several successful defensive operations along contested border regions. Unlike the isolated colonial militia we encountered at Ashgrove Landing, Bennett commanded a coordinated fleet representing multiple human settlements, suggesting that intelligence regarding our fleet movement had reached human command well in advance of our arrival. Admiral Thane attempted diplomatic contact first, hoping to negotiate a peaceful resolution regarding contested mining rights before resorting to direct confrontation. Lucas Bennett responded to our diplomatic transmission with calm, measured confidence that reminded me strongly of Claire Dunmore's demeanor during the failed Ashgrove negotiations. "Your survey teams entered territory clearly marked under human jurisdiction," Bennett stated plainly. "We are willing to discuss reasonable compromise regarding shared resource access, provided your fleet withdraws from contested space immediately and respects established boundaries moving forward." Councillor Mulvane, monitoring the negotiations remotely from Dominion headquarters, rejected this proposal entirely, insisting instead on complete Dominion control over the disputed territory as a demonstration of authority that would discourage future human resistance elsewhere. Admiral Thane, despite clear reservations, found himself bound by direct orders to proceed with military action if negotiations failed to secure full compliance. The battle that followed unfolded exactly as I had feared, though even my worst predictions failed to capture the full scope of what actually occurred. Human forces under Lucas Bennett's command employed tactics that our fleet had never encountered during previous engagements with other species. Rather than meeting our larger fleet directly, human ships dispersed strategically throughout the contested region, using the natural cover provided by asteroid fields and stellar debris to conceal their movements while launching coordinated strikes against isolated sections of our formation. Our sensor systems, designed primarily to track large-scale fleet movements common among other Dominion adversaries, struggled significantly against the smaller, more maneuverable human vessels operating with precise coordination across multiple engagement points simultaneously. Within the first hour of combat, we had lost communication with nearly a quarter of our fleet, unable to accurately track which sections remained operational versus which had been successfully disabled or destroyed. Admiral Thane, watching the battle unfold from the flagship bridge, grew increasingly alarmed as reports continued arriving from scattered sections of our formation, each describing similar patterns of unexpected human tactical superiority despite our overwhelming numerical advantage. "They are not fighting us directly," he muttered, studying the tactical display with growing concern. "They are picking apart our formation piece by piece, forcing us to spread our strength thin while they concentrate their forces precisely where we are weakest." I recognized the pattern immediately from everything Nathan Price had described during our conversation aboard Halden's Rest. Humans were not attempting to overpower our fleet through direct confrontation. They were making the cost of continued engagement so unbearable that retreat would eventually become our only reasonable option. As the battle progressed, human forces demonstrated remarkable technological adaptations, specifically designed to counter Dominion advantages. Their ships utilized advanced electronic countermeasures that disrupted our targeting systems with surprising effectiveness, forcing our gunners to rely on manual targeting procedures that significantly reduced our combat efficiency. Additionally, human vessels employed rapid, unpredictable maneuvering patterns that our automated defense systems struggled to anticipate, having been calibrated primarily against the more predictable combat patterns typical of other Dominion adversaries. 6 hours into the engagement, Admiral Thane received an urgent transmission from Lucas Bennett, offering one final opportunity for peaceful resolution before further escalation became unavoidable. "Your fleet has already suffered significant losses," Bennett stated calmly, his tone lacking any hint of triumph or arrogance despite his clear tactical advantage. "We do not wish to destroy your remaining ships unnecessarily. Withdraw from contested territory now, and we will consider this matter resolved without further conflict." Admiral Thane, recognizing the accuracy of Bennett's assessment regarding our fleet's condition, requested immediate authorization from Dominion Command to withdraw and negotiate more reasonable terms. Counselor Mulvane, still refusing to accept the reality of our situation, initially denied his request, insisting that continued engagement would eventually overwhelm human defenses through sheer numerical persistence. It was only after receiving detailed damage reports confirming the loss of nearly half our engaged fleet that Mulvane finally relented, authorizing withdrawal under significantly less favorable terms than what could have been negotiated through honest diplomacy from the beginning. As our remaining ships retreated from Varen's expanse, I stood beside Admiral Thane on the bridge, watching the tactical display show human forces regrouping efficiently, having sustained only minimal losses compared to the devastating consequences suffered by our own fleet. "This is only the beginning," Admiral Thane said quietly, more to himself than to me directly. "If Counselor Mulvane and others like her continue pursuing this path, our empire is going to learn a very painful lesson about the true cost of underestimating humanity." I could only nod in silent agreement, having already witnessed firsthand exactly how devastating that lesson could become when pride and ambition outweighed careful strategic consideration. Unfortunately, neither of us yet realized just how much further this conflict would escalate before the Dominion finally accepted the painful truth we had both tried desperately to warn against. News of our losses at Varen's expanse spread through Dominion territory within days, despite attempts by Councillor Mulvane and her allies to minimize the scale of the defeat through carefully worded official statements. Unlike the aftermath of Ashgrove Landing, this incident proved impossible to fully conceal, given the sheer number of surviving crew members who had witnessed the battle firsthand and the significant military resources lost during the engagement. Rather than accepting the clear message humanity had sent through their measured, restrained response, Councillor Mulvane used the public outcry surrounding our losses to justify an even more aggressive escalation. She argued before the full council that humanity's tactical success at Varen's expanse represented a direct threat to Dominion security throughout the entire border region, requiring immediate and overwhelming military response to prevent further humiliation. Admiral Thane, still recovering from the psychological weight of commanding a fleet through such a costly defeat, argued strongly against further escalation. He presented detailed reports outlining human tactical capabilities, emphasizing that continued aggression would likely provoke an even larger coordinated response from across their entire settlement network. His warnings, much like my own report months earlier, were dismissed by council members eager to restore what they perceived as damaged Dominion prestige. A massive fleet mobilization was authorized, representing nearly a third of the Dominion's total military strength, with orders to launch a comprehensive offensive against human core territories, rather than limiting engagement to contested border regions. I argued desperately against this decision through every available channel, submitting additional reports emphasizing that such an extreme escalation would almost certainly provoke humanity's full military and industrial capacity, rather than the isolated defensive responses we had encountered previously. My warnings were once again dismissed, this time with considerably less patience than before, as council members grew increasingly frustrated with what they viewed as excessive sympathy toward an enemy species. Within weeks, Dominion forces launched simultaneous strikes against multiple human colonies along their extended border network, hoping that overwhelming force applied across several locations simultaneously would prevent humanity from concentrating their defensive resources effectively at any single point. The response that followed exceeded even my most pessimistic predictions, confirming everything Doran Petch had warned about years earlier during that fateful council meeting authorizing the Ashgrove Landing annexation. Humanity did not respond with scattered, isolated defensive actions limited to individual colonies under direct attack. Instead, within days, their entire settlement network mobilized simultaneously, coordinating a comprehensive military response that drew resources, personnel, and technology from every human-controlled system throughout the region. Colonies that had previously operated with significant political and economic independence suddenly functioned as a single, unified military and industrial network, redirecting manufacturing capacity toward rapid production of military vessels and equipment. Admiral Henry Vance, commanding humanity's combined defense fleet, employed a strategy that our military analysts had completely failed to anticipate. Rather than attempting to defend every colony simultaneously against Dominion attacks, Vance concentrated the majority of human military resources into decisive counterattacks against our most vulnerable and strategically important fleet formations, allowing several less critical colonies to sustain temporary damage while ensuring that Dominion forces suffered catastrophic losses at the points where victory would matter most. This strategy proved devastatingly effective. Within the first month of full-scale conflict, the Dominion lost nearly half of the massive fleet initially deployed for the offensive, suffering losses far exceeding anything experienced during our entire 4,000-year history of interstellar expansion. I remained attached to Admiral Thane's command staff throughout this period, watching in growing horror as humanity's full military and industrial capability revealed itself far beyond anything our intelligence reports had previously suggested possible. Their shipyards, previously assumed to focus primarily on civilian infrastructure and modest defensive vessels, demonstrated remarkable capacity for rapid conversion toward military production, churning out increasingly sophisticated warships at a pace that our own more established manufacturing systems struggled to match. More concerning still was humanity's apparent willingness to accept significant sacrifice in pursuit of decisive strategic advantage. Reports indicated that several human colonies had willingly accepted temporary occupation or significant infrastructure damage, understanding that Admiral Vance's broader strategy required concentrating defensive resources at critical points rather than attempting to protect every settlement equally. This willingness to accept short-term sacrifice for long-term strategic advantage reflected exactly the psychological resilience Sophie Marlowe had described during our conversation aboard Halden's Rest, the deeply embedded cultural understanding that setbacks represented temporary conditions to endure rather than permanent defeats to fear. 6 months into the full-scale conflict, following a series of increasingly devastating defeats along multiple fronts, Dominion Command finally began seriously considering the possibility of negotiated peace rather than continued military engagement. Councillor Mulvane, whose political influence had diminished significantly following the catastrophic consequences of her aggressive policies, found herself increasingly marginalized within council deliberations, replaced by more cautious voices advocating for diplomatic resolution. Admiral Thane, whose reputation had actually improved despite the overall Dominion losses, given his consistent advocacy for caution and restraint throughout the conflict, was appointed to lead diplomatic negotiations alongside myself as his primary intelligence advisor regarding human cultural and strategic considerations. Our negotiating team traveled to a neutral meeting point, escorted under careful diplomatic protection, where we met directly with Admiral Henry Vance and several human political representatives, including, to my genuine surprise, Claire Dunmore herself, who had apparently risen to a significant advisory position within human interstellar governance following her earlier success defending Ashgrove Landing. The negotiations proved considerably more complex than typical Dominion diplomatic proceedings, largely because human representatives approached the discussion with a combination of firm resolve and genuine willingness toward reasonable compromise, rather than the aggressive posturing common among many species we had previously negotiated with throughout our empire's history. Admiral Vance opened the discussions with characteristic directness. Your empire initiated this conflict based on assumptions about our capabilities that proved significantly inaccurate, he stated plainly. We are willing to establish reasonable boundaries and trade relationships moving forward, provided your government demonstrates genuine understanding regarding the consequences of further aggression against human territory. Claire Dunmore added additional context that struck me deeply, given our previous encounters throughout this entire conflict. We do not seek conquest or domination over your empire, she said. We seek only the right to determine our own future without external interference or forced annexation. If your government can genuinely respect that boundary, we have no interest in pursuing further conflict beyond what circumstances require. Admiral Thane, recognizing the genuine opportunity for reasonable resolution, negotiated terms that ultimately proved favorable toward establishing long-term stability, despite requiring significant Dominion concessions regarding previously contested border territories. Human representatives agreed to establish formal trade relationships and diplomatic protocols, while firmly establishing clear boundaries regarding Dominion authority within human-controlled space. The resulting treaty, later known throughout Dominion records as the Varan Accord, effectively ended active hostilities, while establishing humanity as a fully recognized interstellar power deserving genuine respect and careful diplomatic consideration, rather than the dismissive Tier 7 classification originally assigned following our first contact years earlier. Following the conclusion of negotiations, Dominion High Command commissioned a comprehensive review of the entire conflict, seeking to understand exactly how such a significant miscalculation regarding human capabilities had occurred despite multiple warnings provided throughout the preceding years. I was called to testify extensively regarding my research and direct observations, finally given genuine opportunity to present everything I had learned without the political dismissal that had characterized previous attempts to share this information. The Review Commission's final report, distributed throughout Dominion military and diplomatic institutions, contained a formal directive that would eventually become widely known throughout the empire, the very phrase that gives this account its title. The directive stated clearly that humanity represented a species whose psychological resilience, cultural unity during moments of external threat, and calculated willingness to accept significant sacrifice for strategic advantage made them uniquely dangerous adversaries, regardless of apparent technological or numerical disadvantages during initial engagement. It emphasized that previous assumptions regarding humanity's limited interstellar experience had proven catastrophically inaccurate predictors of their actual military and industrial capabilities once genuinely provoked. The directive concluded with a warning that has since become standard protocol throughout Dominion diplomatic and military training, taught to every officer entering service regardless of their eventual specialization or assignment. Never provoke humans unnecessarily. Their capacity for calculated restraint conceals devastating capability that only reveals itself once conflict becomes genuinely unavoidable, and by that point, the cost of continued confrontation typically far exceeds whatever advantage initially seemed worth pursuing. I remained within Dominion intelligence following the conclusion of the conflict, eventually receiving promotion to oversee an expanded human behavior division tasked with maintaining ongoing diplomatic and cultural understanding between our two civilizations. My work in the years following the Varan Accord focused largely on preventing future misunderstandings that might otherwise lead toward renewed conflict, drawing extensively upon relationships I had cultivated with human contacts including Sophie Marlowe, Claire Dunmore, and several others who had proven instrumental throughout this difficult period. I often reflect upon my own initial reaction to humanity, the dismissive laughter shared among colleagues during our first intelligence briefings regarding their species, the casual assumption that 4,000 years of Dominion expansion made us naturally superior to a species barely beginning their own interstellar journey. That arrogance nearly cost our empire far more than the significant military losses we ultimately suffered throughout this conflict. What I learned instead, through direct observation, careful research, and genuine conversation with individuals like Sophie Marlowe and Claire Dunmore, was that humanity's true strength never rested primarily within their technology or military tactics, impressive as those capabilities eventually proved during our conflict. Their true strength rested within something far more fundamental, a deeply embedded cultural resilience shaped through countless generations of hardship, struggle, and survival against overwhelming odds throughout their own planetary history. They approached conflict not with the arrogant confidence of a species assuming inevitable victory, but with the quiet, determined resolve of a species that had already faced extinction multiple times throughout their history and refused to accept that any future challenge, regardless of scale, could prove any different from challenges they had already overcome before. I think often about Commander Rallick's final words to me before his reassignment following the original Ashgrove landing incident. His request that I remember what I witnessed so that someday, someone within our empire might genuinely understand the truth about humanity, rather than dismissing it through convenient political rationalization. I have tried, throughout my continued career, to honor that request as faithfully as possible, sharing everything I learned not to diminish our own Dominion's accomplishments throughout our long history, but to ensure that future generations approach humanity, and indeed any species we encounter throughout our ongoing interstellar exploration, with genuine respect, rather than the dangerous assumption that unfamiliar technology or recent interstellar experience somehow indicates inferior capability, or recent interstellar experience. Sophie Marlowe once told me, during one of our final conversations following the conclusion of the Varan Accord negotiations, something that has remained with me ever since, shaping how I approach my ongoing work studying and maintaining relationships between our two civilizations. "We do not want to be feared," she said. "We simply want to be understood well enough that conflict never becomes necessary in the first place." Fear leads toward exactly the kind of miscalculation that started this entire war. Understanding, genuine understanding, leads toward the kind of lasting peace that benefits everyone involved, regardless of species or empire. I believe her words represent the most important lesson our entire empire eventually learned throughout this difficult period, one I continue trying to apply throughout my ongoing work today. Humanity never sought conflict with the Dominion, never desired conquest or domination over territories beyond their own established settlements. They sought only the same fundamental right that every species throughout the galaxy ultimately desires, the right to determine their own future without external interference or forced submission to authority they never willingly accepted. Our empire learned that lesson through devastating conflict that could have easily been avoided through genuine diplomatic respect from the very beginning. I only hope that future generations throughout the Dominion, and throughout every empire that eventually encounters humanity, as they continue expanding outward among the stars, remember this account clearly enough to avoid repeating the same costly mistakes that defined our own difficult history with this remarkable, resilient, and ultimately honorable species. Never provoke humans unnecessarily. I learned that lesson through direct, painful experience, and I sincerely hope that this account ensures no one else throughout the galaxy needs to learn it the same difficult way that I did.